and welcome to the Beginner's Handbook. I'm Jordan.
I'm Jamie.
And this episode we're going to be talking about sensitive subjects in your games. So, what's a sensitive subject to you, Jamie?
Well, that's a good question, and the main thing that hopefully you'll take away from this is that just because something's sensitive for you, it doesn't necessarily mean it's the same for everybody else that's there. But in terms of the kind of things that we're talking about violence, which will, again, in a minute, we'll kind of differentiate that between combat in a game, because quite a lot of the RPGs, at least that we're playing, will have some form of combat involved. So we'll kind of delineate that a little bit. So we'll look at violence as a kind of umbrella theme in a little minute. Horror again is something else. Romance is a separate theme. We've also got a video that's either out, or this might be out, then that other video on romance is out. So there will be, or there is, a deeper dive into that if you want to have a wee kind of look at that as well. If we remember, we'll put a link to that somewhere. And other things as well can be in and amongst that as well. Even something like religion, which again is probably something that a lot of people wouldn't necessarily see as a sensitive subject, but depending on what your kind of core beliefs are, and depending on what happens in the game, then you might be freaking out about that. If you kind of go for some kind of Da Vinci Code inspired, that might not be fun for you. So before we get into all those different topics, and before we look to that in a little bit of detail, we've got our kind of opening question for everybody, which is...
Well, for the first one, what we would like to know is, have you ever had an uncomfortable situation in your games? It's just good to know, especially for players. Recently I've had some games that have been quite intense, and we know each other, so we're very good at making sure we toe the line. Even some of the games we've been involved in, we've had that sort of thing. But we'd like to know if you've had a game from a player perspective, and if you have had one that's uncomfortable, was your GM aware of it, that you were uncomfortable, that is, or if that was the case or not the case, were you the only one that was uncomfortable? Was everyone else okay? We'd just like to know a wee bit more about it, just because I've not personally had one where I've felt uncomfortable, but I'm also I run a lot of these sort of games as well, just that's the sort of material that I'll maybe play, like Call of Cthulhu. But the second question that we might have,
so it's kind of geared towards any DMs that are there. So this one's a little bit different. So rather than you being uncomfortable, have you ever sprung an uncomfortable situation on your players? Now, whether that's been a complete accident or whether you've done that intentionally to get the players either out their comfort zone, or whatever the reason is, whatever the creative decision behind that is, and if it has came about accidentally and you've seen people getting uncomfortable, how did you resolve that if that was the case? This is another wee thing that we'd quite like to know. And after that situation appeared, was there any kind of fallout from it? So did anybody start crying? Did that happen? Did anybody not talk to you for 3 weeks? Or what was there any issues that happened because of that decision? So we'd like to know about that as well.
I do know but one example where I killed Jamie's character brutally and he never spoke to me for a whole month.
Yeah.
That's not actually true, but if you've heard some of the other episodes, you would have heard about the time I killed his 2-year-long character. No, it wasn't my fault. I blame the DM at the time a lot. It's absolutely my fault. One actually thing I would be interested in hearing from folk as well is, have you got any tools or techniques, let's say as a player, that you ask your DM to use, or vice versa, maybe you're a DM that you kind of have these, is there any tools, strategies you use to make sure people don't get uncomfortable? Just wondering. I've got a few that I've done, and we'll cover some of the ones that we recommend later on, but it'd be interesting to hear what maybe other people's opinions are, just in case there's something that we've maybe missed.
That'd be interesting as well, actually, as well. So And the way you can do that is if you're on YouTube watching this just now, then there's the comment section underneath, and if you're on one of the other podcasting platforms, then you can get in touch through Facebook. There's Twitter there's a Discord server kicking about as well. And there is Instagram, although I think I say this nearly every episode. It might be a bit strange doing it through that, but break the mold, be creative, be different. Why not?
Yeah, cool. That kind of takes us on to outlining what we would consider sensitive, and Jamie's already covered like the subjects that maybe if it's like violence, or it's like a whole bunch of stuff. It could be violence or religion. When you spoke about religion, the thing that jumps to my head is, if anyone knows about Warhammer, especially 40k, I don't know so much about the fantasy side of it because I've not looked at it before, but the Warhammer 40k RPG is like, everyone is just like, you're for the Emperor, and you've got some people that aren't so much for the Emperor, but if you're not, it's heretical, and it's just total. I had no idea how brutal 40k was, and it wasn't until I found out how brutal it was, I was like, I've got to see more of this. It turns out one of our pals is right into it,
Yep. Yeah.
But that's basically all very religious zealot stuff, and like it's like ultra Catholicism, So I mean, religion can be a tough subject in games like that, but there's also things like combat can be involved as being sensitive if you particularly go overkill. We'll maybe mention some of the systems in a second that maybe do that and maybe encourage it. So if you're not into that sort of stuff, or ultra violence, 40k is an example that you wouldn't want to play, but we'll cover that, a wee bit more of that in a minute.
Yeah.
But the other thing as well, thematic games. So while there are subjects that you can make you uncomfortable, or the subjects in your games that you might experience, sometimes you get games that might be thematic that can take some of these things, like maybe if you wanted your theme to be about abuse or confusion or aggression, anything that could, abuse in particular, a whole game evolving around things that are thematic like that can be quite difficult to get through.
Yeah.
Especially games, I'll come into some of them in a minute, but that's other things as well. Just be aware that there's also themes of your games that can be sensitive as well.
Yeah, that's the thing. I mean, ultimately, the thing to kind of think about before you do anything here is that when somebody is, back in their home and they're away from your company, you don't know what's going on, and even if somebody's in a relatively good place just now, you don't know what's happened previously in their life. And just a kind of real world example here, there's a broadcaster that I was reading about here, and won't get into details of the story and things, but relatively successful and other things, and then he recently was talking about things that happened to him when he was at school, and even though his parents pursued some of the things that happened there was very little done about it, and that's something that he's kept buried for like 50 years or whatever it is. So I mean, on the outside something can seem great and perfect, but it might be a very, very, very different kind of reality there. So with any kind of sensitive theme that we might be talking about further down the line here, it might seem completely innocuous to you, but again, you're not living inside somebody's head, so just tread carefully with what you're doing. Yeah,
and just I alluded to this just a second ago. Certainly if you're listening or watching and there's games that basically there's games that pretty much focus on mostly sensitive subjects. They don't always have to, but there's games like Cult Divinity Lost. I talked about abuse as a theme a minute ago. I think I've read about 3 different scenarios, and one's a huge campaign that is basically about abuse. It's like, it's not a cult game unless you've got someone being abused, or there's I maybe won't go into some of it, but it's pretty brutal, and that's fine. That's the games around that, and the chances are if you're playing a Cult Divinity Lost game, you're going to be somewhat aware of what the content is. But there's also the Alien RPG, which is awesome, but it's like super violent, and it indulges in what the films kind of do as well. There's like a D66 table that's all critical injuries, and most of them are brutal, and they cripple your character if you get them, and in some cases you outright die in the most violent of ways, but that's one that does indulge a lot in violence, and things like Call of Cthulhu that can always verge on religion. It's more cult, but usually the themes, it's about sanity, and especially when it's in the 20s, while we're speaking about stuff that's kind of more visceral, kind of sensitive subjects. Call of Cthulhu can actually bring in sensitive subjects. I didn't even think about this until now, but if it's in the 20s, there might be sexism going on and all of that other stuff. Racism's obviously clear when the H.P. Lovecraft based stuff as well, especially in the 20s. So even some of the subjects they bring in, while those games can be quite violent and can bring in a lot of stuff, there's also even just other aspects like racism and sexism that can come into your games. If you want that in games, that's fine, but just be aware that if you look at these RPGs, that you might come across games that some of their the actual scenarios you get for them might contain some of that stuff, especially cult. That's a heads up. I think the actual handbook, the core rule book for cult, is very clear. You push the boundaries a bit, so just be aware if you're reading that handbook, although it's absolutely beautiful and I recommend it. So one of the best printed handbooks I've ever read, except for Morkborg, which is also one of these games that's super violent and miserable. One of the classes revolves around being gutter-born scum, meaning you've been put in the gutter as a child and kicked and left to rot. That's like literally the whole point of that whole character. But it's also a fantastic game as well. But again, it's one that's a bit more, it's more kind of satirical, black metal, apocalyptic stuff. But these are all darker games, so just be aware when you get them. They're awesome and I recommend them, but it's just worth mentioning if you're going to cash out in a handbook that's like 50 quid, that it might have some unsavoury stuff in it.
Yeah, that's exactly it. Just if you didn't know any of that before, then you know now, and hopefully that's enough to kind of steer you in a better path, rather than kind of walking into something blindfolded and ending up again like however much you've paid down the drain and then wishing that you hadn't bought it. So
saying that, I just spent a whack of money on Pathfinder because it was on sale. The local comic shop near me shut down, but actually it didn't shut down, it's got saved. I've just realised, remembered. But I mean, the thing is, actually saying that about Pathfinder, I mentioned some games there that tend to focus on things that are a bit more hardcore, we'll say. But just because these games focus on being hardcore doesn't mean they always have to be. But on the flip side, games like D&D and Pathfinder's a bit more crunchy and a bit more hardcore by nature in terms of rules. D&D is kind of seen as quite fun, high fantasy, power fantasy game stuff. But that doesn't mean that these games won't cover some kind of controversial or sensitive subjects either, because ultimately if you're playing with adults, there's probably going to be adult themes in it, and it's the same thing that the games industry's had as well, where games conferences now get blasted for not having too much adult content and not enough kid games. But the reality is the people now working in the industry are people that used to play games as kids, are now adults making games for them. So it's just bearing that in mind. You can play D&D or your Stars Without Numbers or your Goblin Quest, whatever else that you want to play. But that doesn't mean that they can't have some sensitive subjects too, but that'll be to the GM's discretion, I suppose. Yeah,
that's exactly it. So for something like, again, D&D just as a kind of base example, then in general, the kind of overall themes behind that are it's fantasy and that you're going on some form of adventure, and you're going to take your character from whatever point you start at and continue to build and grow and develop that character through, however long your campaign's going to be. So it's kind of about the growth and the development of that character. There isn't necessarily a kind of defined starting point, whereas some of the other games that Jordan's mentioned, it's more about, again, those darker themes and how your character's relating in that theme or that world, which is a bit darker. So again, depending on the DM you have and everything else, they could be thrusting you in a kind of Dickensian world where you're down a coal mine and you've never seen the light of day for the past 14 years or whatever, and you're only 6 or something. It's just whatever it's going to be from your DM. So again, we'll drift on to a kind of couple of points there as well about kind of outlining what's going to happen in games and things a wee bit later on. So we'll not get too bogged down in that just now, I don't think.
That and how to maybe handle some of these different subjects as well. I'm kind of laughing quite a bit here as you're talking, because I'm just thinking about some of the nonsense. Like, speaking about Morkborg, there's a class I just got from one of the expansions. If you've not got Heretic, Morkborg's Heretic expansion that's in there, there's something called a Shedding Vicar. So just to give you an idea of what the Morkborg world is like, if that's how you even pronounce it, it's Swedish and I don't speak Swedish. But there's something called the Shedding Vicar, which is basically, it's like some religious nut kind of idea.
Yep.
But their whole thing's their skin can fall off and that. So one of their abilities is they can peel off bits of their skin and use it as whips. It's wild, man. It's hysterical. But again, that's the sort of game Morkborg is. But and even then, like I spoke about Call of Cthulhu maybe having racism themes and all that as well. But D&D does as well. Actually, quite often has themes of racism, especially our campaign. We've been oppressed practically most of the dwarf campaign, to be honest. But I mean, it's probably going to be in your games. I know that I think they're actually, Wizards of the Coast are going to be changing how the classes are done to try and avoid some of the race insinuations or whatever it is, but we'll see how they handle that. But
well, we've kind of given you the kind of the red flags and the games that maybe should have more than one red flag attached to it as well. But we'll I think we'll shift on and we'll look at violence as a kind of a sensitive area for people, and we'll give our kind of thoughts on that, and again we'll kind of talk about what we mean by violence versus kind of what somebody else might be thinking about it. So before we start talking about anything, what do we mean by violence? Well, for me in the game, if I was defining it as being violent, it would be anything kind of above and beyond what would be considered combat or a contest or a fair fight, if you look at it from that point of view. So if you have like your character and you're walked into an ambush and you're going through the turn order and it's turn apart, right, okay, you've killed that enemy and you're moving on to the next person again, kind of sticking in a sort of D&D realm just now, then that to me is combat. You have been attacked, you are then defending yourself and you're working your way through. That's all fine, that's all good, because chances are with D&D you're going to run into combat at some times. That's kind of expected and kind of standard. If you look at again something else like Stars Without Number as an example, again you might not necessarily be expecting to run into combat and you might try to avoid that because of the way the system is. It's a bit less forgiving if you get into a fight, but again, if you get ambushed and if you then defend yourself, then well, that's all on the level, it's all within what you can do. You're pulling out a laser pistol and you're firing it. Well, why do you think you've got that laser pistol? It's not for decoration, right? All makes sense. But where that would change into violence for me is if after somebody has been killed in whatever way, if the character then repeatedly shoots at the person whilst they died 3 turns ago, then well, that's verging into that violent world for me. If you've got again a character there and you're trying to get information from them and they're not actually being particularly forthcoming, and you decide that what you're going to do is you're going to, again sticking in the Stars Without Number realm, you're going to shoot them in the foot. You're not doing anything to outright kill them, but you're going to cause them a lot of pain over a period of time to try and extract that information. Torture is what that's called usually. If it's something like that, then that is when, to me, it's in that violent realm rather than, and it falls under combat and in general can be accepted by most people. So things like that, things that are to the extreme. And again, you might think, well, isn't killing somebody a bit extreme?
Yeah, in D&D.
That's true, but in most of these games, if you've if somebody's dug you up and you haven't killed them, chances are you yourself have died. So it's it's kind of dog eat dog and all the rest of it. But
that's maybe just the games we play then, I suppose, if it's not like that for everyone else. But I suspect it might be the same for everyone.
All the comments start flooding in and we have to re-examine ourselves.
People die.
Yeah, but that's basically for me what it is. It's anything it's going to the extreme, and when it becomes out with the realm of fair or a contest, then that's probably verging into the violent realm. And for yourself, Jordan, what constitutes violence?
It's kind of I kind of like how you break it down. For me, like I'd say, like it's all violent. I mean, basically any role playing game, pretty much all of them you're going to play is going to have some form of violence in it. D&D can be quite violent. Now, depending on, but just because you can play this with like first timers that are scared of anything even remotely graphic, and you can still have violence in your game. But it's more about the execution. It's just the scale of it. Like doing your fighting scene, you're going to hit someone. Sure, that's still violent. It's just like slow down. It's almost practically nothing. Whereas you might explain your hit. Like I do that a lot with my character, where I'm talking about trying to cut them in half. I'm a big barbarian guy. So I think really it's not so much that there's a line. For me, when it gets to sensitive is when when you get the actual minutiae, the detail when you talk about it. Really, a lot of the time we play a lot and we get a lot of freedom. The DM's really good, where he'll let us describe how we're doing it. It actually encourages us to be quite narrative. I talk about being narrative a lot, and he gives us a lot of opportunities to do that, just to make it more flavourful and more interesting.
Yeah, and just to kind of jump in at that point there, the other thing that's good for as well is that, and again, the difference with us in that particular campaign, we've all known each other for a long time, so we're all pretty comfortable with each other, and we all know the boundaries before before anybody pulls out a piece of paper with everything written down on it. So by getting us to then explain what's happening and what's going on, and combat or whatever it is, it's then keeping it a bit more sanitized, in the sense that if you've got somebody that's a bit more squeamish, they are going to avoid as much of the detail. If you've got somebody that's a bit more relaxed, then they'll do their own thing. Whereas if you've got your DM who's to whatever extreme, then it can potentially be too much for somebody. Whereas if you get them to describe it back to you, then it's the words coming out of their mouth, so it's all good from that point of view. It's
actually good. I never thought about that, because later on we'll maybe just talk about the things that you can do to help sensitive subjects, and violence is a very easy one, because it's pretty much when it comes to combat, it's very easy, but certainly allowing people, when it's in the combat context, letting people describe what they're doing, what their move is like, what their kills are like, letting them do all that kind of lets them say what they feel comfortable with. And some of our games are very bloody, but that's because we're okay with that, and we know that we're okay with that. I think if some of the games that I've got ready, that I've been running recently, that we might play at some point with the rest of the guys, I might be trying to push those boundaries just a wee bit. But this anyway, we'll come on to kind of how we can monitor where that line is and what's too far, what's not far enough if you're trying to be shocking. Although I would be a bit cautious with trying to be shocking. But anyway, but that's really violence. Is there anything else on that you want to kind of bring up, or? I've not really got much more, but
I've not really got anything to kind of add to what violence is or anything like that. But I mean, ultimately with violence, if it's, again, hopefully you don't run into this situation, but if it's somebody that came, from sort of, they've had a violent past or whatever, and you start going into details of people getting injured, or whatever it is, then you could have somebody that's getting upset. You could have somebody that's panicking as well, which is going to be, personally speaking, somebody that's panicking and getting stressed out to me is worse than somebody that's getting upset, because with somebody that's upset, you can just kind of stop what you're saying at that point, and then everything will calm down gradually at some point, or you move on so that you're not dwelling on anything. But somebody that goes to that extreme, then you're in different territory at that point there. So you've got somebody there that can be potentially freaking out with that. You've got somebody there that can be getting, again, like we're saying, upset there. So with violence, more than anything, you're going to get potentially extreme emotional reactions, whereas like some of the other topics, when we drift onto them, you'll maybe get things that are more like anger or being upset in the sense of annoyance or something like that, rather than they're actually like on the verge of tears or anything like that. So violence is one that again is probably one of the ones to be kind of more careful about.
I would say so. Just as we're speaking, this, I don't know why this didn't come to me sooner. I think violence, the sort of violence we've spoke about, is actually it's more offensive than some of the other stuff we'll talk about, but it's definitely the least offensive when it comes to how far violence can go, because it's not just like describing a horrible injury. It might be gore, or maybe you've got a theme of body horror, in which case it's all David Cronenberg everywhere. You've got flesh everywhere that's dripping and all that sort of stuff. It can be a bit much for some people that maybe don't like that. I know a guy that I studied medical visualization with. He was fine with cadaveric studies, but literally a drop of blood would make him pass out, and you're going, okay, so like that in a game for him is like way too much. Whereas even though he does something kind of relatively grisly, I suppose people would kind of categorise it as, but violence isn't even just that or just to go. There's also other aspects of the violence, like maybe it's like domestic violence you're actually putting in a game, or maybe there's some form of other abuse, and not delving too far into it, but you get what I'm talking about. That's also encompassed within the violence area, and that's maybe where certainly these other more serious, maybe more real subjects, like it's much better just to make sure, like that's the stuff that can really upset people, like having a violent scene of like you shoot someone and their head blows up, like it's easy to recover from that compared to some of the other things that we've just mentioned. Like Jamie, you spoke about people panicking. I've never really had anyone panic about a violent shot, although maybe when people can get uncomfortable with it, but it's different when you bring in things like physical, like more different types of violence or abuse that we spoke about, or even mental kind of trauma that can occur to players in games like Call of Cthulhu or Cult, which is all about your dark secrets and all the horrible stuff that comes with that. So that's definitely something to think about when we're talking about violence, because that could be stuff that we're bringing into as well.
Yeah.
In terms of one of the other subjects we've got is Jamie, talk to me about horror.
So horror, again, I think that's quite self-explanatory with that. You're
it's more thematic.
That's the thing. It's more thematic rather than a kind of action based, that something happens which then falls into that category. In general, if horror's appearing in a game, it's an overarching theme. It's not that you're in the middle of a fantasy setting and then someone gets sprung on you, which is in that realm, and then 5 minutes later it's done and it's gone, and then you're carrying on with the game. So if somebody just doesn't like being scared, then chances are a horror-based game is not going to be for them, and they're going to be uncomfortable from the first second up until the last second. So
brilliant.
So
that's what I look for. Not really, but
victims. So if it's, when we're talking about that, then obviously there's different types of horror. There's like wandering down a path and then something unexpected happening and it being kind of short and sharp to get a kind of a panic, a jump, just a kind of general scare. But then you've got kind of darker stuff that, if you went in having whatever your horror theme is, if you're dipping into some of the kind of darker periods of history, like that's been about, and if you actually start kind of drawing comparisons between things, if you've got a player that's aware of that, then that can unsettle them more, because rather than something that you've completely came up with and you're 100% relying on their imagination, if you're drawing parallels between something in the past, like a particular serial killer that you're both aware of, or whatever, then that person now doesn't need to do 100% of the work themselves and imagine it, because they've got facts, they've got news stories, they've got whatever it is, so they've already got that foundation that they're then putting their imagination on top of, so it can enhance the kind of fear factor behind it. So with horror, it can bizarrely it can be harder to kind of upset somebody with it, because again you're having to rely on their imagination, but depending on how you craft it, you can kind of get quite a dramatic result depending on who you're playing with.
Yeah, one of the games that we done, I mean, the thing is, you can have a horror game that maybe doesn't even need to delve into some of the stuff with like actual gore, but you can have a horror game with no gore or like horrible abuse themes or anything like that. One of the games, I mean, there was probably violence coming in, but we never got that far. One of our pals ran a game, God, what was the event? It was the Franklin Expedition.
Yep.
And it was actually more about sanity, because it's like you just go nuts, and but there was cannibalism going on, so it was actually more, it was a horror theme, but it was more, rather than it being outright like just very in your face horrible for different reasons, although there was maybe a couple of moments where there was horrible things we would see. It maybe wasn't violent per se, from what I remember at least, but it's more unsettling. That's the thing. And like Jamie's saying, horror can be really hard to make, really, like, to upset someone with horror can be hard depending on how you craft it. But then if you're good at running horror games and you know what people are kind of uncomfortable with, you can really twist the knife a bit with it. So it's just definitely, it's one thing. Just be a wee bit careful of, you don't want people to be not enjoy themselves. Whereas, to be honest though, you might find for the most part, if someone's coming in playing a horror game and they know the themes are going to be around a couple of things, let's say you're doing, like I talked about Alien, and you're doing an Alien RPG, people that play that, especially if they know Alien, they'll know what they're getting in for. So while you could run the horror game, you don't need to worry so much. Although one thing that I've been using recently is like jump scaring folk, because it's a lot of fun. That's one thing that I suppose is part of trying to scare people. You actually might try and scare them, actually, like for real, like like physically scare them. Do that with a pinch of salt though. You don't, it's something that you can unsettle people with that, but you're probably just going to annoy them if you overuse it.
Yeah, that's that's the thing. Overexposure can reduce that creative tool. I think is the kind of the best thing to take away from that.
Yeah, I think there's a whole episode in horror, by the way, because there's ways to do it. There's ways to do it, and there's ways not to do it.
Yeah, and again, it's like I kind of talked about it, but I don't think we kind of talked about it like this. Like with horror, I think it's more obviously on a spectrum. Because you'll get people that will be more affected by psychological stuff. You'll get people that will be more affected by the physical, physically, like rattling a table, just as you're, talking about like a door slamming shut or something, or whatever kind of variation and on that you're doing. Whereas when it comes to violence, to kind of quickly compare it between the two, well, in general, well, not in general, everybody knows what pain is, whether that's the worst thing that's ever happened to them is that they've stubbed their toe, or whether it's, you know, they've been in a situation where they've been hit, or, you know, worse. Everybody has some, you know, personal experience of pain, whereas with horror, well, you don't need to watch a horror film. You don't particularly need to go out and, you know, find yourself in a scary situation, but, you know, pain happens to everybody, you know, every single day, to bigger and lesser extremes. And then as well as that, it's a lot easier to imagine what it's like to be, you know, attacked by another person than, you know, to imagine what it's like to have, you know, a werewolf chasing you down the street. You know, that's something that's so out with, you know, the realm of normality and probability that it just is, you know, again, you need to have a decent imagination to get that to be something real for you. Whereas, you know, imagining what it's like for somebody to hit you over the back of the head with a shovel or something, then you go, well, I think it's pretty easy to figure out how that one would be.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, this is something though, horror, like Jamie said, it's a spectrum, and I mean, I think all of these can really be spectrums, but horror's one of these more nebulous ones that, but it's one thing I know can freak people out though, like it can really just get under people's skin and have them. The first Cthulhu game I done for some guys a couple months ago maybe now, and a couple of them were completely new to it, and they knew what they were getting in for, you know, but he was like, he was just a wee bit paranoid. It's like after you watch a good horror film and you're kind of like, I want to walk down my hall with no lights on, I'll maybe just put a light on just for now. You know, it's that kind of thing where you can get into under people's skin. It's a more interesting subject, and crafting a good horror is difficult, but it can have quite a profound effect, especially when you combine it with some of the more horrible themes that you might get under a violence subject or a thematic game around something not so pleasant. So yeah, the last theme we've kind of got is it's nothing like the others. It's maybe explicit for other reasons, but it's romance. Jamie, kick off some romance.
What were you? No thanks.
Cut to Black. We'll cover Cut to Black later.
So when it comes to romance, is the kind of umbrella term that we've used here, and again, talking about spectrums, you can make that however extreme you want to be thinking about this. So I don't know if this is currently out, depending on when you're watching or listening this, or if we're doing this in reverse order, or how it's going to work, but we've got an episode which we look at that in a bit more detail, and we cover, you know, things like why people will be uncomfortable and ways to maybe avoid that happening, and again a couple of examples for, you know, games that are currently kind of going on where that's happening. But for romance, that can, again, talking about it as a spectrum, it can be as low key as two NPCs with whatever's happening with them, all the way up to you've got two players acting something out in front of you. So as you might be able to tell from the kind of the snigger over there, that's something that probably we would both be a bit uncomfortable with if there was, you know, two PCs and they're acting out whatever they're acting out. That might not be the case for you. You might get somebody that's completely uncomfortable with the idea of two unwed NPCs sharing the same house as each other. You know, it could be to that other extreme. So that one, I mean, with horror, if you freak somebody out, okay, you didn't necessarily mean it, okay, give them a bit of time, they'll get over it, not that big a deal depending on what's happened. The same with violence, okay, they might be a bit shocked, but again, in general, if you give them enough time, they'll probably get over it. Whereas with romance, because it can be something that's it can make somebody cringe and want to just a hole to open up and just swallow them, and for them to disappear and never be seen again, then that's something that can, potentially put them off for a long period of time. But also in the episode that we kind of look at romance and we look at that in more detail, something that I mentioned in it is, at the end of the day, you need to remember that if something happens that somebody freaks out about or is extremely uncomfortable with, they're not looking at that and going, well, that was the two characters there, and they're not going to be talking to you and going, right, the next time you see your character, can your character not do that? No, they're going to look at you and they're going to blame you for it. And at the end of the day, I don't think the kind of, I was just acting. I don't think that'll kind of hold up particularly well. At the end of the day, it's you that's putting somebody in that situation, and you're making them that level of uncomfortable, and depending on what you're doing depends on whether that becomes something that's either innocuous or very, very, very serious from a kind of genuinely from a legal point of view, depending on how freaked out they are with it, and depending on
suggesting people might get sued for D&D games.
Well,
I don't think it's outside the realms of possibility, but so far I've not had that issue.
I mean, like, and this is.
Have you thought of suing one of us for running one of our games? Is that what's going on here?
Not yet. But completely off topic. I was unfortunately in a position where I was in a room with somebody talking, and as part of their job, they act out different scenarios and things, because it's part of work with customs. So it's interrogation stuff, to try and get answers from people to find out why things are being smuggled and different things. So anyway, so the guy's going along, and he was to be the smuggler in the situation, and there was a woman that was there interrogating, and she's going through as part of this training process. And what he done is he then, during the process, he then touched her arm, and basically, like, the scenario ended shortly after that. And then, like, a short time later, he gets pulled into an office, and he starts getting read the riot act from his bosses, and his strange and naive defence was, but I was just acting. No, what you've done is you've touched her and you've made her uncomfortable, and as a result you might lose your job.
I'm glad you said arm, because I didn't know where that was going until you finished that. I was like, oh god, no.
Well, that's what it was left with. But that's a mess. Yeah, so I mean, like, if a similar thing happens, at a table or whatever, then again it can have proper consequences. So again, when you talk about violence, you're not physically standing up and hitting somebody with a table leg or something. When it comes to horror, you're not going, and then they start getting chased by this werewolf that I'm apparently obsessed with, and then, like, you open the door and out jumps the werewolf and starts
another
chasing
werewolf.
Everybody.
There's now two werewolves.
Yeah, a werewolf inside the werewolf. That's not necessarily going to happen, whereas something like that could happen very easily, and it could cross a line very quickly.
Speaking about physical boundaries and stuff.
Well, again, physical, or whether it's somebody that's, again, acting in inverted commas there, something out, then you go, well, again, depending on all sorts of different things, how tight your particular country's laws are with stuff like that as well, depends on how quickly that can become a legal matter rather than something else. But none of this constitutes legal advice. I think I should fire that out.
I also don't think you would need to worry so much about that in a D&D game, mostly, especially because the fact is, if you're having people around at your table, maybe different online, especially if you're going to show explicit content. That's something like handouts. You know, we've actually had handouts in some games that were like real life crime stuff and things like that. Now we're okay with that, and we knew it was kind of part of the pitch, if I remember right. But you know, if you're going to bring like actual unsettling content, like that's really a no-no, because be very careful if you are going to do that, like, because that's the stuff like that Franklin expedition when I spoke about. We were showing some of the stuff from the Franklin expedition, like the recovered bodies or something. I can't even remember exactly what it was. But I mean, it's stuff, and the guy didn't want the shows and stuff, like, you know, we kind of pressed them like, come on, you've got us this far, can't be that bad, and then you're like, ooh, it's not that nice looking. But you know, that's fine. But then if you're talking about some violent stuff, like you might, if you're going to show an actual crime scene and things, like I've never experienced that, I've never heard anyone experience that, but I wouldn't put it past people to maybe actually include that in a game and make people uncomfortable.
I wouldn't be surprised. I'm
sure there's something online that there's somebody complaining about it, but for sure, generally though, I wouldn't say it's something to worry about if it's people you know, for example, like in terms of talking about legal stuff and all that. Like, cause for the most part, like, you're going to be playing with pals. Although that would be a plot twist to a story if the guys turned around and tried to arrest one of us. I think your character sucks, get him in jail. So it's definitely, it's a subject, especially if you're bringing in real stuff. I think that's probably something that, when we spoke about violence, that's stuff that if you're doing things that are more real, like we spoke about abuse, and I think violence generally is not so much, but when you talk about werewolves, there's that kind of suspension of disbelief happening, you know, and that's what role play will allow things to happen and things. But when you're talking about even PvP, but it might be people assaulting other people and things like that, might be a bit more uncomfortable, you know, versus something a bit more fantastical. So definitely if you're doing something that's a bit more realistic in nature, it's always worth just making sure that people are okay with it, because if you don't, then you might upset someone. It's like the first time I had somebody join a Cthulhu game that was new, and I thought their boyfriend had told them what was involved, and they didn't. And as soon as it happened, it was like, oh, this sort of stuff's really scary. And it was when all the monsters were starting to tear people apart, and I'm going, oh, we've got about 2 more hours of this, so here we go. So it's just worth just getting extra care for that as well. There was something you said earlier, I'll come back to it if I remember what it was, or something that you said before when you were talking about freaking out people's your fault. That's what it was. I think ultimately that's a good point. If people get uncomfortable at your games, and someone being uncomfortable is not strictly bad if you're going for a horror theme, that might be the point. If it's a cult game, their advice is to push the boundary a bit, because that's the point. You want people to feel uncomfortable and kind of go take the emotional roller coasters their characters are going to experience. That's kind of the point. But there's a difference with being uncomfortable and just offending people because of the subjects that you're doing. And I know that that's a line, it's hard to know, and some people might think that they're okay with something until it comes up in a game, or they maybe just didn't expect the level of detail it might go into. But certainly it's one of these things, like I know people that run games, and the exact thing that he said, I won't go into too much detail about the guy, but he was always wanting people to die, which is fine if you want to kill people all the time, that's okay. But his goal was always to make people, like, he wanted at least one person angry at the end of the night because of stuff that had happened, because that's a real emotional adventure. And I'm kind of thinking, like, that's, for me, that's too far the other side. And don't forget, when you're running your games, like, if you do make something that upsets someone, you can apologise for it. There's only so much, like, you're not going to mean it. I'm sure most people don't mean it. You know, I've never really been part of a game that somebody's get really upset, but again, that's mostly because we know everybody that plays the games. But if someone is upset, it is your fault as a GM, so you should really be the person to step up and kind of apologise and etc. But ultimately, remember, people need to have fun. That's the point. Now, someone being uncomfortable doesn't mean they're not having fun. You know, there is that kind of line. The kind of thrill seekers might be looking for that line between discomfort and unpleasantness. But people need to have fun, you know. And like when that guy had said, I remember him when he said that he loved the fact that he told me about a game. He's like, half of the players were really angry at the end of the night, and he was like, haha, this was amazing. I'm going, man, that just does not sound like fun. That kind of sounds like someone putting down their fist and making people do what they want them to do. That's fine if that's how they want to play games. I'm not judging. Well, I'm judging, and my judgment is I don't think that's a great way to do it, because ultimately if you're running a game, you should really, the goal is to make people have fun. If you have a different opinion, I would love to know where that comes from. Why wouldn't you want people to have fun at a game? I know games might be more serious in nature, but I run a lot of horrible games because of the sort of games that I play, but people still have fun. You can still be unpleasant but have fun. But if you've got a different opinion, I'd be interested to know what that difference is, because I know that the guy I spoke to said my game sounded like just very happy-go-lucky. I'm sitting thinking, I just ran a game that was fully about abuse. Like, that was the whole thing. I don't think that's pleasant. But then players come out and say, that was really good, that was really engaging, you know. So there is a line. So I'd love to hear someone's different opinion if they've got one.
And it's kind of that thing as well, that you can make somebody uncomfortable, you can unsettle somebody, you can make them squirm, or you can just outright get them disgusted and have them freaking out, or, you know, whatever kind of shade in between that. So if somebody is probably at the point where they're uncomfortable is the point where it's starting to possibly go too far. If somebody squirms a bit, then you're probably still alright. If you're kind of unsettling them a wee bit, they're probably still alright. But when it's out and out completely uncomfortable, then you're too far at that point. Whereas if you're getting them uncomfortable but they're still kind of engaged, they're still kind of tentatively kind of try to explore whatever the subject is or whatever the situation is, then, you know, that's probably your kind of, you know, your toes on the line and you're getting ready to tip over to the other side of it.
It actually opens up a whole thing. Like, I mean, as the GM, you are really the referee of what's going on. And I think, like, just in terms of like running myself a lot of horror games, like the point, even in some of the published books, they iterate multiple times. You want people to be on the edge and all that and blah blah blah, and that's okay. But I think that's maybe something that you'll gauge really easily at the table, unless you're just totally tone deaf to it. I think for the most part people are quite clear. But one thing, if you are doing games that generally might be uncomfortable, it's the subject matter and the detail you go into that you need to be careful of. Like the stuff we spoke about. When you're combining that uncomfortable scenarios with gory details of violence or any other horrible theme that we might have mentioned already, or, you know, it's worth just making sure you just approach them with sensitivity in mind. We even spoke about religion. It's not come up again, but if you get people, well, I've played games with people that are very religious, but we've played games that are grotesquely occultish, and that's okay. But I also know people that think Ben 10's satanic. So I know one person that thinks that. So, and I'm not even joking, like, that's too far for them, and I would love to get them around the table to see their reaction, but I would never do it. Because that's just, I know it's too much. It's so far. I'm not even joking. It might traumatise them. Like even D&D would be enough to traumatise them. So, but then I know that, and then I'm not getting invited. So, and if they ever asked to play, I would say, well, it's going to cover this, and this, and I can see the blood drain from their face. But it's just one of these things. It's just be sensitive about it. I think it's really the main thing. That kind of pulls us into the comfort zone, although we're kind of covering a lot of that. Is there anything you want to kind of bring in specifically around players' comfort zones when they play games?
Yeah, so like with somebody's comfort zone, there's no reason that you can't push that, but there's a difference between pushing where the boundary is and outright just trampling over it and then going 3 miles down the road with it and then carrying on and keeping going, and to the point that they're way beyond that. And it'll kind of relate back to what sort of personalities you've got at the table. You know, if you've got people that are okay with their, you know, with trying to, you know, explore new ideas, or, you know, they're always trying something new, or whatever it is, then you go, right, well, the amount that you can push that person is probably going to be a lot more than somebody who's quite shy and introverted, and, you know, the complete opposite of that. So if you already know the personalities that are at the table, it's going to give you an idea of what you can push and what you can't push. And again, getting the kind of difference between when you're pushing something and when you're just outright ignoring that other person and just steamrolling over them and doing what you want to do. The kind of main thing from it is that getting somebody who thinks Ben 10 is satanic, and getting them to sit down and play a game of like Cult.
I've actually joked about doing that, and it's literally the response from people I know that know him's like, no, that cannot happen.
Yeah.
And I know it can't. I mean, I'm not going to go into Cult here, but my God, I mean, speaking of pushing boundaries, it reminded me of the Blades in the Dark character that I had, which was just a wee silly, for anyone that's played Blades in the Dark, it's like gangsters or that sort of thing. I played this guy that's like a hunter-gatherer type guy. Naturally, someone was racist immediately to me. I think it was it Thingy's character? I think it was one of our pals' characters. Straight away, I'm like, oh God, here comes the racism. But my guy got wild. I don't know what happened that night. It was like I must have had a boring week, and my guy get weirder and weirder, and it ended with a chihuahua, I think, eating somebody in some cult ritual. Although that wasn't my idea, although it was to some degree, but I think the GM took and made it much better than I could have in that night. But pushing boundaries is good, like Jamie's saying, but you need to just, I think probably a bit of advice for it, we spoke about before, is you don't need to, if you're doing something maybe there's a subject you're not sure how's this going to land, you don't need to just dive right into it. You know, it's better to take baby steps, shuffle towards it, than kind of just dive straight in. I've done this a lot, just to give you an example, for some of the horror games that I've done that maybe have a lot of monsters in it, and usually if it's like a Cthulhu game or something like that, the monster's going to look horrible and have goo bits and blood and all that kind of nonsense. But you can kind of describe it in bits. You know, there's ways that you can kind of introduce some of the horrible bits, and as people kind of freak out, once you've got that bit where they're like, oh, that's horrible, you know, you can go, that's enough.
Yeah.
You don't need to go anymore, and you can watch people at the table. I had the same thing at a D&D game. It was a new guy, practically sat and didn't do much because he was completely new, and that's okay. But I did keep a special eye on him because he was new to the group, really, and the game. And I wanted to make sure the guy wasn't uncomfortable, because there was bits where the other players were being brutal against other NPCs. And I could see the guy was a wee bit like, I'm not sure about this. So I was like, okay, so anyway, guys, and then kind of moving it on for that guy. So if you're running those games, keep your eye out for that stuff. And even if you're pushing the boundaries a bit and pushing players in small steps towards something big and horrible, or if the players are doing it for you at the table, it's worth just being conscientious about people around the table and putting a stop when you need to, because you know, people are allowed to be upset at something. You know, it's not really up to you to determine what offends them or not. But if somebody is offended to something you think is ridiculous, then it's maybe up to you to decide if you need them at your table. Not to be dismissive of them, but you either need to change your games, or if you're refusing to do that, be respectful to that person's kind of attitudes towards things, and just say to them, it might not work out, it's fine, that's okay.
I mean, that's exactly it as well. I mean, as we've talked about previously, being a DM, it's not a case, again, at least in my opinion, and I think your opinion as well, it's not a case of going, right, okay, well, here's the story that I've got, and you know, this is how it is, and this is what's going to happen, and it's almost like, you know, being part of a dictatorship, rather than the DM is going, right, okay, well, here's the story, but how do my players then fit into that, and am I giving them enough room to explore the world and do their own thing, or am I forcing them down a path that they aren't naturally wanting to go down? So for me personally, like, the best DMs are, it's almost like having another player at the table, because they are engaging and interacting and taking your thoughts and ideas on board. And again, they might not be overtly asking you, right, okay, so what do you want to do, what about this, what about that, but they're either physically taking notes or mentally taking notes, and then they're putting the things that you want in front of you, and that you keep moving forward. And by the time you realise how far in the campaign you are or whatever, you realise that you've actually accomplished a lot more than what you think you did. So that's, to me, the best sort of DM. So if you've got somebody there that is, again, freaking out over whatever you've introduced, then they'll be taking that on board. So if it's something that's just on the cusp of what you're able to cope with, if you've got a good DM, as soon as they realise that, they'll tone it back slightly, and then the story hasn't diverted too much, and everybody can all still enjoy it and carry on with it. But at the same point, if you are, if you're turning up and you're wanting to play a cult game, but you think Ben 10's satanic, then it's probably not going to work out. And there's
I like
no
how you say
issues.
there's a chance that it will work out, because you said probably.
There's always a chance.
Maybe I will invite them to the table next week.
Yeah, why not?
What's the worst that could happen?
What's the worst? But there's no issue with telling a DM, I didn't realise this is what it was going to be like. This isn't going to be for me, so I'll check out just now, and I'll join back in when you're playing this game or whatever it is. Yeah. So there's again, if you've got a good DM, then there'll never be an issue with bowing out or something. Just obviously let everybody know, don't just randomly disappear and show up 4 weeks later and ask what's happening. So there'll never be an issue there. And the kind of flip side with, if you're a DM as well, and if you're doing something which the start point is way too much for somebody, and even scaling it back by a good margin, it's still going to be way too much for them. Again, if you've got a decent player there, then they'll get and understand that there's only so much that you can change for what you've planned, what you've thought out, and again, they'll be all right with it. So there isn't an issue with telling somebody, look, I don't think this is going to work out for you, and sticking to your plan. But if you're there or thereabouts with the person, probably tweaking it is the best thing to do. Yeah,
I mean, it just goes back to communicating with your players and being conscientious about what people's needs and wants are. And there's somebody playing the Alien game, we've got one more game in that, and one of them's like, when can we do that Harry Potter game you've made, Jordan? And I'm going, right, and I spoke to her about it, and she's actually happy to play the games, but the sort of alien world's way more intense. Like, she loves Disney, so I'm not really expecting. I didn't really tweak it for her specifically, because she knew what she was in for, number one, but it was like the intention was to finish this anyway. Actually, if I remember right, I didn't even know she was coming until I showed up and she was there. I was like, alright, okay. Nice heads up, guys, here we go. I'm now not changing this because of that, but because I just didn't have the time. But it just meant when it got to the horrible things in Alien, I just went, right, I'll cut out some of that. Okay, your guy gets bitten and it tears at his throat. Right, next. I don't explain it, whereas normally for the guys I would explain and kind of dramatise what's happening, just so they're like, oh crap, I'm dead, whereas that week I had a few people go, oh, so I'm going to get back up and stab it, and I'm like thinking, he's just had his throat ripped out, he ain't getting up. He's like,
you understand you need your throat to breathe, don't you?
Now part of the issue was just I couldn't explain it, so I was really just kind of going, oh, and then I had to explain it briefly and I say, you're dead. It's like, okay, death saves. I'm like, not in this game, man, sorry. But it's just, but then even at that kind of more dynamic situation, I was like, right, I'll just need to take out some of the stuff I know is going to make them uncomfortable. You know, like some of the more super violent stuff that Alien kind of embellishes a wee bit, not embellishes, but relishes in having in its games. So okay, I think that's me for that sort of stuff. I think the last thing on that topic of being conscientious is, as players, if you're a player and you're doing a game and you love describing your kills or describing some action you're doing, I would actually say for the most part, unless your DM or GM's been kind of doing stuff at certain levels of detail, I would let the GM kind of tell them what you're doing and describe it at high level. You can give them detail, but leave it super high level and let the GM take the lead, like you're saying, because they'll be the people that can dictate and take what you've gave them and feed that back into the loop of the game in a way that will help describe the scene and set their tone. And really what you're doing is giving them all those tools to make your game cooler, and it's you that's doing that as a player. You know, a good GM will actually do that for you. But especially if there's a game that, you know, it's maybe sensitive in nature, you can, you know, you'll maybe figure out after a couple of games how far you can go, and if you've known people for a while, you'll know how far you can go. But if you're not sure, if there's new people, let the GM handle that. And it means if they make the mistake, then at least if they go too far, it's them that gets blamed instead of the player turning around and saying, I hate you because of that. I mean, I've had that happen at a table, but not for like detailed reasons, but there's been things like, oh, why did you say something like that to the group? You know, and it was because the guy had went ahead, basically was wanting to persuade people to do something, and he said, I'm bleep, bleep, bleep. I was like, okay, so you say beep, 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 and I filtered it for him. My intention was to soften it so he didn't put everybody in a position where they're going to get arrested, but he wanted that said. So, but anyway, that's just, it's not the same as maybe offending people, but remember, everything's getting filtered through the GM, or should be, so just let them take the lead.
And again, just with what you're saying there, if it's a group of players that you know well, then, you know, you describing, you know, what you're doing and what's going on is probably going to be all right for 99.9% of occasions, and you're probably not going to need to worry about that. If it's a group of players that you don't know, or it's a newer group of players, or it's a group that you only know through playing whatever game it is, whatever RPG it is that you're playing, then again it's probably good to let the GM take the lead with the descriptions, because chances are they've done their own kind of vetting process for who's there and what they're like, and you know, different things there. So let them take the lead, and as well, after 2 or 3 kind of repetitions of that, you'll get the kind of thing that they're describing anyway. You know, if they're being very basic in the detail, or if they're, you know, kind of going, you know, just slightly beyond that, or if they're going into super graphic detail, then again you'll you'll figure it out after 2 or 3 repetitions, I think. Yeah,
it's worth just letting the GM go through the calls for that one and figure that one out themselves instead of you getting the flack for it. But I think then really what I would like to just talk to you about, just, I mean, there's not really much to say about them, but maybe just offer a wee bit of an olive branch, and we've actually covered one of them, which is talking to your players. So I'll maybe lead with that one. I think for me the big part of it is, especially if there's something intense, although to be honest, I think I don't do this with you guys ever, although one, I've not ran a game for you guys and I don't know how long, but I probably wouldn't do it for you guys. But then I know, like, the guys that Jamie and I play with, we've known each other for a long time, and tend to make you uncomfortable. That's like, I really want to do that and I can't wait, but I know they're okay with it. But generally what I would like to do, like, soon this week I'm going to be running a game for someone's birthday, and it's going to be, they've asked specifically, to my surprise, to run Morkborg, for me to run Morkborg. And I know some of the people going, I said, it's pretty intense, like, I said, I'm not going to hold back that much. I'm going to do it as it's intended to be run, because I know that some of them also enjoy that as well. But having that conversation, when I meet with them, to have that conversation, I'm going to be seeing, like, even just briefly when we're making characters, I'll be able to figure out, like, so we're doing a session 0 as well. It's a very short game we're playing, so I'm going to be trying to figure out where's people's kind of boundaries for stuff, because of how tight the time is, and because I don't know half of the players that are coming. I like personally don't know them. I'm going to need to be figuring that out on the fly, but that'll be where I start to use things like just pushing people a wee bit further each time until I see somebody actually getting a wee bit properly uncomfortable. But other than that, I'll be making sure that if people are uncomfortable, I'll be saying to them, let me know. No, it's a game. That's the point, and we want to have fun. If people are having fun and uncomfortable, great. But if they're just flat out uncomfortable and no longer having fun, then I'll want them to tell me that. But I'll make that clear, because some people won't want to be like, excuse me, I think this scene is horrible and I don't like it anymore. People won't do that. But there'll be ways that you can encourage at least that conversation.
I mean, even just something as simple as like each individual person's own politeness. If you've got somebody that is pretty polite, if you're in the middle of describing something, you're going into detail about it, and it's you've been talking for a couple of minutes or whatever, then it's like a scale. Does this person's politeness outweigh how uncomfortable they are, or is how uncomfortable they are, is that now overtaking the politeness? So depending on depending what they're like, will depend on what's going to happen there. So if they're more polite and more uncomfortable about interrupting you, then how uncomfortable they feel with what's going on, then potentially they're going to sit there, not going to say anything, and at some point down the line the same thing will happen again, and it'll be the same situation, and they're just sitting there not enjoying themselves. I
think the case I've got this week, it's a kind of unique use case. I think the reality is, though, you're not going to really, for the most part, unless you use one of the other tools, which we're just about to come on to, people aren't going to tell you something like that was too far during the game. Now they might, if it's not to do with violence but something else, they might actually signpost it to you. But the reality is, you need to just make sure you just, especially with darker games, the benefit of Mark Borg is it's more slapstick violent than it is. I mean, it's very unpleasant, but it's dark humour. But definitely make sure you can facilitate that game and that conversation. Like after the game, if it's something that's going to be more than one game, check with your players and do it maybe individually. They might not say anything outright. You can ask the group and then just double check after the fact. I know that our pal did that with one of the games where he had introduced this weird abused sex robot, which turns out when he spoke to us about it, he was like, that wasn't a sex robot. And both of us were like,
liar.
Well, that was exactly what it was. But obviously that was a wee bit of a miscommunication, or at least how it was described. That's not how we both received it separately. But and we weren't in any discussion of that at all. It was done through Roll20, so we were in completely separate houses. We both get given the same information. We both drew the same conclusion, and we both said at the end of the game when we were talking about it before we finished, and we both said exactly the same thing, that's what it was, and then we got told no, it wasn't. What I think happened in that is I think it was, and then because of the way that we talked about it, then he backed away from it really quickly, like no, that wasn't what it was. I mean the thing is, though, regardless of whether or not it was, although I think it was, the theme of the game was actually trafficking anyway, right? So even if it wasn't sex robot, even though it was, but regardless, it was like people being transported to get them away from a horrible area, etc. So, but ultimately the themes of the game, they were unpleasant anyway. So even if there wasn't very clear idea that it was a sex bot, like even if it wasn't, and let's say that it was described in a way that we didn't think that, like it's still a theme of trafficking, so we wanted to make sure that we were comfortable. And that was kind of like, was that it? what happened to the sex robot? And he's like, what do you mean sex robot? What are you talking about? But but anyway, that's going to happen though as well. Sometimes the miscommunication will happen in some of your games. So.
Yeah, but I again with that particular game, like
it's funny though.
It was that, and then when you then layered on the kind of trafficking that was going on, you then went, right, there's absolutely no way that that's not the case. Like it so overtly is, and then to be told, no, you were reading into that more than what was there. What are you talking about? You're like, no.
Yeah, I mean, I'm fine. Just going. If you don't think it was a sex spot, that's okay. But to me, it definitely was. But I mean, that's okay. But ultimately, the guy did the right thing. Regardless of what his intentions were, he still came to us to check were the themes. Sorry, were we comfortable with them? Was anything too far? Yeah. I'm sure the pitch for it was probably. I think unless I'm mixing the games up, he did let us know it was going to be a bit darker. No, it was, because I was like, oh. Finally something dark's happening, and it was like, no, that didn't happen. But he gave us that pitch, so we knew what to expect, and because of that we kind of, but he did the right thing coming and letting us know that, was it okay, and we were like, fine, and then it was like, great, so he didn't need to worry anymore. But the reality is you'll probably be doing that, especially if it's new groups or new players or strangers, whatever. It's good just to check in with them when there's been a tough game. And even with current players, like there's games, I mean, I've been wanting to run that cult game, the Black Madonna, and you guys I think would really like it. But it is probably something that I would check in with yourself and the others for it. Certainly there's a couple of bits in it that are like, I remember going, God, I heard this was brutal and it's not that bad, and there was one page I went, oh. I mean, it made me double cross it, which it's got to be pretty intense if I'm going to double, like, oh, okay, wow. But I would, for stuff like that, especially even if you've got a comfortable group, if you've maybe pushed the envelope quite a bit regarding sensitivity, maybe just check in with people just in case. Yeah. Because it's better just to make sure that you're building, I hate using the phrase safe space because everyone memes on it, but you want people to be comfortable playing your games, and if they were uncomfortable, you'd want them to feel safe enough to bring it up without being slagged rotten and all that stuff.
Yeah, but ultimately that kind of ties back to what we talked about earlier, which is, at the end of the day, you're playing a game. Yeah. And what's the point of playing a game? Well, it's to have fun, it's to totally relax, whatever. So if at the end of it you've got somebody that's stressed out or upset or whatever it is, then you go, right, well, the whole point of playing this game has been lost. We've not done what we were supposed to do. Aye. Something has went wrong. So again, although and you can do it in different ways. I mean, you can physically at the end of the game go, right, how did everybody find that? So on a scale of 1 to 10, how traumatised are you? 10 being lots, 1 being not at all, right? You could be as avert as that and physically go round everybody and ask and whatever else you need to do, or you can kind of take a more subtle approach with it, and just ask people in general, or wait to see what they say at the end of the game if nobody's talking to you. And again, if it's you're in person and you're playing the game physically, and they all pack up their stuff and then head out the door, and nobody says anything, maybe not a good sign. But if everybody stays and is asking you questions, going, the bit at the start when we went to the basement, why was that, was this, was that, if they're asking you questions and then appear engaged about it, probably they've got on all right with it, and you probably don't need to worry.
Yeah, I would say as well, because I think just in terms of how you run your games, or how your groups are, like you mentioned, like people get up and leave and all that, like that doesn't strictly mean that it's too far either. The best way you'll find out if someone personally is a wee bit like where they stand on that scale is just speak to them separately. It only needs to be a couple of minutes. Hey, how was that? Was anything too far? I'm not sure. That's like literally all you need to. Even if you're sure it went fine, you just say, I'm not sure. Yeah. And just ask for that help, and people will be more than happy to give you it, and they'll probably be honest, probably. I mean, there'll still be some people that maybe don't.
And again, I think we've talked about that previously a couple of times, that if you're a DM that a good strategy for troubleshooting or a good strategy for potentially diffusing kind of situations that are getting a bit tense is that after you've done whatever you've decided to do, then when you're talking to either the group as a whole or individuals, to then turn around and say, to blame, I'm using that kind of loosely here, but to blame yourself for it. So again, in that situation, if you look at something and you go, they look really uncomfortable here, I've went, I've been a bit heavy with the violence or whatever it is, then at the end of it go, I think I was a bit too much there with what I'd done, and talk about it from your point of view and talk about it that you've done too much, even if you think that again that it's absolutely minimum what you've done, and that it makes Ben 10 look like a satanic death cult or whatever. Still, you taking the flak for it, even if you don't necessarily 100% believe it, then it'll probably help that person open up and give you a more kind of honest opinion, because they're not worried about pointing the finger, going, oh, that was too much for me and you shouldn't have done that, or whatever. That they might be worried that that's the way it comes across, rather than that they're just saying, oh, it made me a bit uncomfortable. I mean, I'm not, I didn't really enjoy that, or whatever it happens to be. So taking a bit of the flack is a good way of kind of...
Yeah, I kind of I would even kind of go further to say, instead of kind of seeing it like taking flack, I mean, it's the same thing, but I'm saying this more because I know people that this is my games. I just think if you're going to be saying that as a GM, this is my games and you should run it the way, or you should play it the way I want you to run it, I just think you're kind of missing the point. Now maybe that's controversial, I don't know. I just know all the best games I've played is by people that want to play with the players. Even when they're running games, they want to play and have everyone have fun. Doesn't mean that you bend the rules and all that nonsense. It's nothing like that. It's just that you want people to feel safe, to enjoy it, and have fun. That's basically the point. So when it comes to actually approaching people and saying, how did you find that, and talking about taking the flak for it, I would go as far to say it doesn't really matter what you think. You just say, how did that go? It's not... My point is, it doesn't matter what you think. As a GM, if you're asking someone about something sensitive and how they feel about it, it doesn't... Because for me, my barometer for violent content, when I almost said the name there, when our pal had talked about that game with the sex bot in it,
the chameleon,
the sex bot, with air quotes, because he'd said how was that, he gave us a pitch and said how was it, and we were like, oh, wasn't that whatever, there was nothing in that we thought was crazy. That doesn't mean it wasn't an intense game or anything. It just means that our kind of resilience for the sort of content that was in it was enough for it to not really bother us at all. So when you're speaking to other players and you're checking if they're uncomfortable about it or not, it's just approach it from that perspective, okay, how did that go for you? And ultimately, if you're asking them, you're probably not sure how they've taken it, and that's probably the way to frame it. Now, if you get upset at what they say, then I think you just need to pull your socks up a wee bit and kind of just come on. I mean, if you want them to play, you need to come on. Just think about them. It's not just about you.
Yeah.
But I think for the most part, I don't think, other than maybe one person I spoke to and one person I played with, out of the years I've played this, there's only literally 2 people I've ever encountered. And one was I've just heard about out of those 2 that had there was certainly a kind of power thing about playing games that they had. But for the most part, I'm sure you'll all be fine with it, because I'm sure, all of us, when we run games, you want your players to have fun too. So I think then that kind of leads us on to the last couple of ones, and I had them as separate, but honestly you're probably going to use them. If you use one, you'll use the other. So I'll maybe start with so there's something, I've never used this personally, but there's something called the X card, And what that is basically, I can't remember if you give every player one or there's just one and you tap it. But basically the function of the X card is if you start doing something that crosses a line and it upsets someone, the idea is they tap the card or they maybe raise their card to you. So for those players that do get uncomfortable and don't want to tell you because they don't want to interrupt you or whatever they think they might be doing, you can then go, okay, cool, and you can just move on from it. And a great way to do that is by cutting to black, or I call it the curtain call, where you kind of, let's say you're getting dragged into some pit for your guy to get butchered up by some monster. So you can explain that he gets dragged into the depths while you feel like daggers and all that kind of starting to go up your legs. Maybe it's a tentacle with teeth on it or something, who knows. And then gets pulled into a door and the door slams shut and echoes throughout the hall. You can fade it there. That's it, cut to black, fade it out, or end it in a note where it happens all off camera, so to speak. That's something I use all the time, not because I don't think players can handle it. I just think it's a smoother. You don't need to indulge the details, and with the X card, you can literally use that when you need to use an X card, or if somebody's identified the fact that they want that's too far, I'm using my X card. But most of the time, even throughout your games, I actually just recommend, like, instead of spending time, especially something that's going to take more than 5 seconds in terms of like violence and stuff, cut to black, fade it out, make it a barbaric blur, a berserk blur. Do something like that to muddy what's happening, so you can, one, tell the story quicker, but two, also let the players imagine the rest of it, because it's still going to hit the notes that you want it to hit. It's just not going to like make it look like you're indulging and just being a bit weird. So that's certainly the kind of two other things that I use all the time. I don't know if there's anything you want to add to that, to be honest. I kind of summarised it, but
no, I mean, just exactly what Jordan's saying there. In terms of the X card, it's probably better if you give every single player one, because again, rather than depending how big your group is as well, rather than people having to kind of, where is it?
And reach over a table and
it's there. Oh no, so somebody else has got it.
That almost defeats the purpose of the convenient card.
Reach around to try and grab it or whatever. It's putting them through whatever experience for a longer period of time than what they actually need to be there doing it for. Again, you don't physically need a card for it. You could have some other pre-arranged thing, like literally just lifting your hand, lifting 2 hands, Team America secret signal, whatever it is that you decide to do. So there's other kind of versions of it, again using that kind of loosely there, so there's other things that you can do, but that is a concept, something that's pre-arranged that lets the DM know, right, somebody's getting uncomfortable, I need to either stop, fade to black, or just dial it back a little bit, whatever it is. It's pretty easy to get your head round, and again, there's different ways you can do that, and again, just fading out a scene is pretty self-explanatory as well.
Yeah, I mean, basically you'll know how to do that when you're running your games. It's very intuitive. I've never used an X card. I don't think I probably will. I mean, because most games I play, or all of them I play with people I know. I don't need to bother with cards and that. And I don't tend to go through horrible details. I've seen people use lists as well. It's like checkboxes, like red, amber, green. Yeah, red, amber, green. I know my traffic lights, I promise. I do drive. Maybe that's how I get in so many accidents. But I've seen people have lists of what is it are you comfortable with, and they've got a list of stuff. And one of the things, I seen this today and I was like, this is ridiculous. And one of the ones was about sexual content, and it was like talking about it, alluding to it, talking about it in some detail, explicit content with NPCs, and then PC to PC explicit content. I would actually argue, I think, now you can do what you want with your games, but for me, I don't really see the point in going into like role-playing sex scenes at a table. I actually know groups that do this. I don't get the point of that, other than some form of gratification. But in terms of even violent stuff, like sitting there and explaining 5 minutes how you slice somebody up for a torture scene, I just don't think it's very necessary. Not because it's offends me or anything. I just don't see what you're getting out of that.
Yeah.
Now, I could see, I said torture scene, I'm sure that there's reasons to have something like that in a game, but I'm just talking about just being gratuitous for 5 minutes about something, you know, or role-playing something horrible. Like, sex scene is a whole different one. I don't know why there's two people doing a sex scene at a table while everyone else watches. I just don't get it.
Yeah.
I would say for anything that's like, and I mean like proper explicit, like anything that's like super horrible, that's going to have more than 10 seconds worth of explanation that's happening, I think best practice, cut to black, fade it out, make it blurry, and let the narrative continue, because I think all you're doing if you indulge for 5 minutes about something explicit is you're risking bigger offence at the table, you're risking more discomfort probably, and you're slowing your game down to a point where it's like, we've effectively stopped this game while you indulge a little fantasy in your head. But I don't know, I've got strong feelings on that, because I do know there's a lot of people I know that would be very uncomfortable with that. I just don't get the point of indulging that far into it. Maybe I'm missing the point, and if you've got a different opinion, I would be interested in knowing what is it that you actually get out of, and I'm not just talking about sex scenes, right, but even explicitly. I had someone in Alien die recently, an NPC, and I explained, because he managed to survive all his death saves, so he kept dying for like 3 rounds, and they're all like, stop and put him out of his misery. And I'm going, you need to do that, you're the players, put him out of his misery. That was 3 rounds, that wasn't even like 10 seconds. And they're like, no, I can't handle it anymore. It's okay, the alien killed him anyway after that. But it's like, sure, that was good, because it built the scene up, it made it more intense, and it made players panic, and it added more stress onto their stress rolls, which was great. But, you know, on the flip side, if it was a narrative thing I was talking about, I wouldn't have... Now, that only ran for 3 turns because it was in combat. But if we were outside of combat, or if they were witnessing from far away someone being killed by an alien, I would just get to the point in 5 seconds. I don't need to indulge in the details and explain how everything blows to bits. So I think just generally, that was a long way to just say it's best practice, cut to black, or not even cut to black. If you still want some of the horrible details, fuzz it up, explain it, and leave it to fuzz and kind of fizzle in their minds, and move on, keep things moving.
Yeah, and I mean, like with the kind of extreme,
I don't think we've had a problem with what I was. We've never had that at our table.
We haven't, and
maybe the Chihuahua.
Yeah, possibly. But in terms of the extreme violence thing, then I think possibly one of the kind of dangers of like RPGs in general is it's people kind of becoming a character, you know, they're doing something that they wouldn't ordinarily do in their everyday life. So, you know, if there's somebody that's heroic, then you know, there's a building that's about to collapse and it's on fire, so they run in and they come out with like 4 kittens and 3 puppies or whatever, you know. It's to that extreme. So when it becomes combat, and again using combat rather than violence, then rather than it staying as combat, it then becomes violence. And I mean, a kind of sideways kind of shoot from that is, I don't know if you've ever seen, it's just a wee short interview, and again I don't know if anybody out there has also seen it. It's kicking about on YouTube somewhere, can't remember exactly what it's under, but it's Christopher Lee talking to the camera and Peter Jackson.
Yeah, I know exactly what this is.
Yeah, so basically, if you haven't seen it, the long and the short is that Peter Jackson, when going through the Lord of the Rings, and spoilers, Christopher Lee doesn't make it, so when he's dying, he gets stabbed in the back and they film it. Christopher Lee acts it out. Peter Jackson calls cut and then goes, no, I want it more, you know, drama, you know, use your voice more. And and then Christopher Lee turned around to him and went, listen, have you ever seen somebody get stabbed in the back before? And it's, you know, this kind of no kind of reaction, and goes, well, I have, and that's exactly how it happens. Now the background for that is that Christopher Lee during the Second World War was involved with different kind of clandestine, operations units out in the Middle East and wherever else. So, it wasn't just somebody saying that and, going, well, that's my interpretation and this is how it's doing it. No, he's genuinely talking about what happens. So, if you take his word as being gospel, then, that's an extreme violent act. It's not, combat where it's a kind of fair fight. It's somebody sneaking up behind and try to kill somebody as quickly as possible. So when you then look at that and how little sound there is, how little flailing about there is, how little there is in that scene, then it, again, kind of coming back to the point here, the extreme violence to me is 9 times out of 10 people that haven't been through extreme violence. They're people that don't get involved in a lot of conflict in their life, and this is their chance to reimagine themselves as somebody that's heroic or tough, or whatever thing is kind of lacking with them, that's what they do, or to give them the benefit of the doubt that they've never seen extreme violence before, so they're kind of going down the Hollywood line and going, this is obviously what it's like, but it's just my kind of take on it.
Yeah, it's certainly something that it's just, I think for me, just to summarise those points, like the conversation is important, and you'll probably be best having that ongoing, especially if it's new players, but having an X card there to know, okay, I've maybe went too far, and it can maybe help in these cases when people indulge too long, where people are like, that's enough, please, stop.
Yep.
But then you can use your cut to blacks. I do them all the time. I mean, some of my games are quite miserable because of the subject matter. If it's a cult game, for example, one of the ones I had, it was all about hobos and drug addicts and stuff. It was pretty miserable, the whole game. But I mean, it was still fun. It was an intense mystery game.
Yeah.
But I was cutting to black all the time in that. Because we don't need to indulge in drug taking habits. You know what I mean? We can talk about it and allude to it and then fade and move. But I think overall then that's basically covered, and that's at least that's a shotgun blast. This might be a bit of a longer episode, but this is a massive. It wasn't until sitting down and starting to talk to you about this that I realised this is a huge subject. I'm sure we might do another part to it, who knows.
Yeah.
But anyway, I think then you've heard our take on various things when it comes to sensitive subjects for players. So what are your thoughts about it? Have you get something different? Do you agree? Do you sort of agree, but maybe we went too far with this subject? Who knows? Maybe we've went too sensitive with sensitivity. Let us know. I would say, where can they let us know?
Yep. So you can let us know on Facebook. You can get in touch through Twitter. There's Discord as well. Instagram does exist, albeit that's maybe not the best way to get in touch, but you can if you want. But yeah, and if you're watching us, if you can stomach looking at us, then you're braver than a lot of other folk.
Braver than me. I don't even look at our videos.
Well, there's the comments down there as well, and if you're, again, depending on what platform you're on, if you follow us or subscribe, depending on what it's worded like, you can like it as well, which helps us out, or dislike it as well. It also gives us feedback of what you want to hear, what you want to see, and what you don't. And just in general, get in touch and do all that social media magic.
Yep, so I think then we'll finish with that, and well, we hope to catch you next time. So first of all, thanks for listening from me, Jordan.
And from me as well, thanks.
See you later.